Shavuot Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah now is going to discuss the halacha of someone who gives raw food to his mother-in-law who happens to be an Am Haaretz to cook for him. The Mishnah says, Hanoten lechamoto, one who gives raw food to his Am Haaretz mother-in-law to cook for him. Me'aseret shu noten la ve'et shu noten mimena. You have to tithe what you give to her, and you have to tithe what you take back from her. Because she is suspected of exchanging food which spoils. And the Mefarshim explain, if the son-in-law gives his mother-in-law who's an Am Haaretz raw food to cook, and she ruins it, it gets burned or spoiled, the mother-in-law is most likely to exchange this food with her own food and give it back to her son-in-law without telling him. So what happens is, she's going to eat her son-in-law's food, which is not tithed, and her son is going to eat her food, which is not tithed. So in order to circumvent this problem, the sages say, whatever you give her tithe, and whatever you get back from her, tithe, that way nobody transgresses any prohibition. Now, normally we said in the previous Mishnah, in Mishnah Daled, that if you give an Am Haaretz wheat to grind for you, or fruit to watch for you, we do not suspect that he changed it with his own and gave it back to you. We assume whatever you gave, you got back. Therefore, you don't have to tithe it when you give it or when you get it back. Why here, by the case of the mother-in-law, do you have to tithe before you give and when you get back? Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, the reason here we suspect the mother-in-law of switching the produce is for two reasons. Number one, she desires the well-being of her daughter. She doesn't want her to have spoiled food. And number two, she's embarrassed of her son-in-law to give him back spoiled food. So since we have these two reasonings, Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to tithe before you give her, and you have to tithe when you get it back. And then Mefarshim do explain, the Rav quotes the Yerushalmi, that this entire Mishnah really is Rabbi Yehuda. And really, the way it's written, it looks like it's a regular author, and Rabbi Yehuda just explaining the reasoning, but it's really all Rabbi Yehuda saying this logic. Now, the Mefarshim do tell us that Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is disagreed by the sages. The Chachamim hold that his mother-in-law will not switch the food, she'll give them back the spoiled food. Therefore, you do not have to separate what you give to her, and you also don't have to separate what you get back from her. However, the Rabbi Yehuda does, even though here he argues, he says, no, the mother-in-law will switch the food, therefore you have to tithe what you give her and what you get back. He agrees with the sages by non-Shvi'it produce that was given to the mother-in-law on the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, on the year of Shvi'it. Modeh Rabbi Yehuda agrees, benoten lachamoto Shvi'it, in the case of someone who gave to his mother-in-law non-Shvi'it food to prepare during the year of Shvi'it, shena chashuda lachlif la'achil et bita Shvi'it. Even in this case, Rabbi Yehuda says, I do not suspect the mother-in-law of switching non-Shvi'it food with Shvi'it food, even if she burns it, even if she ruins it. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda says, granted, I'm concerned by regular ma'asrot. The mother-in-law, the Am Haaretz mother-in-law, she will give back produce that she didn't tithe. But since Am Haaretzot are more careful by the laws of Shvi'it, they know it's more serious than ma'asrot. In their eyes, they take it more seriously. So a mother-in-law is not going to make her daughter sin by giving her Shvi'it produce on the year of Shvi'it. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, in this case, I agree with the sages, even though generally Rabbi Yehuda says, I hold that you have to be concerned for the mother-in-law switching the food. By the Shvi'it case, where I'm giving her non-Shvi'it produce on the 7th year, I do not have to be concerned that she's going to switch it with Shvi'it produce, and the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. That is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Vav and Perek Gimel. Perek Daled Mishnah Aleph is going to continue now. We're moving on to Perek Daled Mishnah Aleph. It's going to discuss, again, even though Am Haaretzot generally are not believed to say that their produce is tithed, the Chachamim have certain exceptions where they were lenient. And the Mishnah says, Halokech perot mimi she'eno ne'eman al ha'ma'asrot v'shachach le'asran. A person buys produce from an Am Haaretz, who's generally not trusted that he separate the ma'asrot, v'shachach le'asran, and he forgot to separate the ma'asel from this produce before Shabbat, and now it's Shabbat when you're not allowed to separate the ma'asel from Demai, because the sages held that just like you're now to separate Masrot from Tevel, from Vadai produce that wasn't separated, you're also not allowed to separate from Demai produce. And the reason for this prohibition is, the Chachamim explain, because it looks like you're being mitaken menah, you're repairing something to allow it to be consumed. So likewise here, you're taking food that's not allowed to be eaten and you're preparing it, you're finishing it off to be eaten. The sages say you're not allowed to do that by Demai. So now you forgot to do it on Erev Shabbat. You come Shabbat, now this is the only produce you have. So the Mishnah says, V'sha'alo b'Shabbat, if you ask the seller on Shabbat, or you're allowed to ask the seller on Shabbat whether you tithed it or not, he tithed it or not, yochal al piv, you're allowed to eat based off his word. Now, the Chachamim say, even though generally you're not allowed to rely on Am Haaretz's testimony, in this case, on Shabbat, you're allowed to rely on Am Haaretz's testimony to eat it now. Why? The Mefarshim explain very interesting logic. Because the Am Haaretz is in awe of the holiness of Shabbat, he's more afraid to lie on this day than any other day of the week. Therefore, the sages say, if you ask him on Shabbat, if you ask him Erev Shabbat, it doesn't count. If you ask him on Shabbat whether he tithed his produce, and he says, yes, I did, you're allowed to eat it. However, the Mishnah says, Chashcha, once it becomes dark, Chashcha Motzei Shabbat, once it becomes dark at the end of Shabbat, Lo yochal ad she'yisrael, you are no longer allowed to eat the remaining produce until you tithe it, until you remove the maaser, even though you were just consuming it several minutes ago before Shabbat ended. The rabbis say you're not allowed to continue. Why? We don't want people to make this mistake that even on Friday I can ask him, or on Sunday. Once Shabbat ends, we want people to know leniency is over. It only applies on Shabbat. Now, the Mefarshim also say it's only talking about somebody who forgot to separate maaser before Shabbat. If he deliberately did it, because he knew this trick, he wants to be able to eat all the produce without having to separate. The Chachamim say, even on Shabbat, in this case, you're not allowed to rely on his word because you're abusing the system. And also, Rabotai, if somebody is known to be an Am Haaretz who doesn't separate Maasrot, then you can't ask him. His testimony would not be valid. It's talking about a person that we don't know, and we're just assuming that he's going to be honest. And he generally separates. Again, Rabotai, most Am Haaretzot biblically did separate. It's only rabbinically because of the mi'ut, the minority, the sages were concerned. Therefore, they were lenient on Shabbat for the sake of enjoying Shabbat, the Oneg Shabbat. Now the Mishnah continues. Lo mitzao, let's say you cannot find the seller on Shabbat, and therefore you're not able to ask whether it was tithed or not. Amar lo acher shenu ne'eman ala masrot miusarin hen. If someone else, who's also not trusted regarding Masrot, and Am Haaretz said to him on Shabbat, miusarin hen, I know this produce is tithed. Mishnah says, ochel al piv. Again, you're allowed to eat based off his testimony, just like you're allowed to ask the seller. You're also allowed to ask you can rely on the testimony of another Am Haaretz who happens to know that it was separated. Again, this is only if you can't find the seller. Always better to go to the direct source. Chashcha motzei Shabbat lo yochal ad she'yaser. Again, when it becomes dark at the end of Shabbat, you're not allowed to eat the remaining produce until you separate the tithes, because again, sages do not want people to take this leniency into the week. They want them to know it only applies on Shabbat. Now, in the next case, we're going to speak about something called miduma. Miduma is a mixture of tiruma or tirumat maaser that falls into chulin. Again, tiruma is the 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th% of the crop that the owner gives to the kohen. Tirumat maaser is the 10% that the Levi gives from his portion to the kohen. Meaning, maaser rishon, I give Levi 10%. Levi takes 10% from that and gives it to the kohen. It ends up being 1% of the entire crop. If that gets mixed into chulin, non-sacred regular produce, since the mixture contains portions that can only be eaten by a kohen, the entire mixture becomes asur unless there is 100 times more regular produce than this tirumat myself that fell in. The Mishnah now is going to specifically discuss a case of tirumat maaser, and the Rav says why. We're going to specifically speak about a case of tirumat maaser. Because the Demei Haaretz are suspected of not separating this percentage that's supposed to go to the kohen from the Levi. The savri, because the Am Haaretz mistakenly assume they think that I will not be punishable by death if I eat this percentage because I didn't give the 10% to the Levi. How am I going to give 10% to the Kohen from the Levi's portion if the Levi never got anything? Therefore, I'm allowed to eat this portion. They don't know it's a mistake. Even if you didn't give the Levi 10%, the Kohen has to receive his 10% of the Levi's portion, or else it can't be eaten. However, the Am Haaretzot are not suspected of not giving the Kohanim's portion to them. They always give the Kohanim their portion because they know that it's death penalty. And again, Tirumat Maaser is 1 in 100 of the crop. If it fell back into its original pile of chulin and it's less than 100, it becomes a forbidden mixture. So the Mishnah says, Tirumat Maaser shel Demai shechazra limkoma. I had to separate now. I bought produce from an Am Haaretz. I had to separate this 1% of the entire crop to give to the Kohen, or else I can't eat it because it's holy. And now I separated it, but it fell back inside the pile. I'm now allowed to eat it now. The only way to get out of it is to find out if that which I separated is really not Terumat Maaser. I never had to separate it. So Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says, Af bechol sho'alo v'ochlo al piv, even during the week, you're allowed to ask the seller. Even during the week, the seller is allowed. Even during the week, you're allowed to ask the seller whether the produce was tithed. If the seller says it was, you're allowed to eat the produce based on the seller's word, even during the week. And the Mefarshim explain, because since I'm asking the Amaretz, did you separate Terumat Maaser? It has the word Teruma in it, shenikra la Shem Teruma. Emad de madua al Amaretz v'yira l'shaker. The Amaretz is afraid, he knows that Teruma is severe, he's afraid to eat it himself. Since he's afraid to eat it himself, he's not going to lie to the person and tell him, I separated when he really didn't. He knows that Teruma is death penalty, therefore he's afraid to lie. So we assume he's going to be honest. And the halakha does follow Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. In this case, Rabotai, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri's view is not accepted by the Chachamim. The Chachamim hold that it only applies on Shabbat, this leniency, for the Terumat Maaser. However, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri says it applies even during the week, because again, Amei Aratzot have more fear when it comes to Teruma, and since Terumat Maaser they think has to do with Teruma, they're not going to lie. They're going to tell you if it was actually tithed. And if the Amaretz tells you, I tithed to the coin already, whatever portion I took out really didn't have to be tithed, because it was already removed. So whatever I removed, it's like removing regular food. Therefore, it becomes permitted. If, however, he tells you he didn't separate it, so the whole mixture becomes asur, since you don't have 100 times more, you'd have to give it to a Kohen. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen.